Hi, I'm Dave,
And I'm Kristen.
and we're product coaches from Austin, Texas. And this is The Clearing, a show about growing into yourself as a founder.
Before we dive into today's episode, we thought we would do a little check-in and see how things are going this week and how you're feeling today.
Yeah. You at home, how are you feeling today? Say it out loud. This is part of the exercise.
Yeah, it's a
I,
trick. We got to say it out loud.
hmm I am feeling a bit weathered before we're about to go on, but we're about to go on vacation, which is nice. We're at the sort of tail end of a 6 week work cycle, and pushing into releasing a bunch of the work that has come from that cycle. So yeah,
Yeah, and we're traveling for quite a bit of time. So we're doing a family trip, and then we've got a trip out to California where a lot of socialization, but it's kind of like co-living, co-working, so very different than what we're doing right now.
yeah,
And being gone for about a month, it's I don't know. There's kind of like there is a felt sense of a looming deadline, and it's not. We used to live on the road nomadically for like a year and a half, so we have experience with this, but being settled and having to like think of moving into that. I
yeah,
haven't started packing and we're leaving tomorrow. So I'm like, oh my God. So for me, yeah, it's just been a lot. So the culmination of the 6 week cycle and part of the focus for that time has been the podcast, which is cool. We've gotten that up and running, feeling more and more comfortable with it. And then we have this new release that we're working on, which is a website. I don't know, would you call it overhaul? What are we doing to the website?
I mean, we are repositioning and repackaging ourselves. The website as like an artifact is the product of that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
so in this process, we have been in the studio, very like
Yeah.
sort of internal, and we've been sending things out. Like the podcast has been helpful in this sense because we're doing iterations of trying to find what we're how we're trying to package ourselves, and then getting some reflection. But generally, we've been doing a lot of finding it and a lot of like internal work, and so we're moving into a transition, uh,
Yeah.
sort of outwardly, and this is
That's just kind of hitting me
stirring
right
up
now.
stuff. Yeah.
Just the difference. I mean, I've been kind of over the last week starting to transition out of that a bit because I don't want to overschedule myself for like FaceTime and like video chats while we're on the road because I want to be present with the people we're going to be in person with. And then for friends that I have here, I've been like catching up with people a little bit over the last few days and trying to keep that at a minimum because there's so much going on. But there is this like feel of transition into being more social. And for some reason, you just talking about that, it dawned on me that like I'm flipping modes,
Yeah.
so it's going to be mostly social and some like sprinklings of the digital, which yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So, and in this phase, when you've done a bunch of work, like in a cycle, and this cycle in particular for us is bringing a bunch of new things out into the world. There,
Yeah,
there are times where you're in a release cycle where you're working on something that's more mature, and you're doing an iteration that doesn't shift a lot of things, and sort of anxieties and unknowns will come up in that process. But this one is okay, we've done a bunch of stuff, we can't really do anything else, and now we need to go wear it out in public.
yeah,
And so it can be really nerve wracking.
yeah, anxiety provoking. And that's the topic of today's podcast is release anxiety. We
Yeah.
found that having the themes be around what we're currently wrestling with and working on, just it makes it so much easier to talk about, and then it's top of mind. So yeah, today we're leaning into release anxiety, and the basic pattern there is you're working on something like you've been talking about, Dave. In For us it's been in the studio, but it might show up differently for other people. It could be that you're moving from just journaling about it or writing about it or drawing about it in your own personal space, and you're about to share it with, maybe it's a business partner, maybe it's with your team, something like that, or followers, users, like whatever, whoever it is. And that move from wherever you've been comfortable in creating your little safe cocoon there out into something more public. So it doesn't have to be the most public, but just more public, more social than it has been. And that move is challenging. Um,
Yeah,
so that's what we're talking about.
that's what we're talking about. Yeah, so it's we mentioned the website, and this one is like very alive right now. And as I talked about, there are different sort of scales of these things. For us, like coming into this new persona, this we're in a place where we have not shopped around this idea a lot, and so there's a particular like
Mm.
taste to the release anxiety. it's um, it's this position where we're reaching out to what we think we're trying to say. We're packaging ourselves in a particular kind of way. This can come up with like sort of branding, with like launching a new product, like all kinds of things, especially for the first time. And it's difficult to go from zero to testing this stuff. You do go through a process of like as you're building out the material and trying on different copywriting and all this kind of thing. I notice myself in conversations like trying it on and seeing if it fits, and a lot of the time it doesn't yet because you don't know how to feel it yet.
Well,
And so
you're not certain about it. Like you're not wearing it confidently, and there's a difference there. And
totally.
there's usually context that's lacking when you're trying things on. You're just kind of are dropping things into conversation, and
Yeah.
sometimes it'll hit, but the whole story is not there. Yeah.
No. And this this can go poorly and it can go well, like, and so it's a bit of a roller coaster, and this can pop up all sorts of things like FUD, which we talked about in another episode, like sort of fears and uncertainties, and like the sort of ghouls will show up and be like, "You don't do this," and like you can freeze and all of these kinds of things. And so, yeah, I don't know. We have been through a bunch of these waves over the past couple weeks in particular. So yeah, it's pretty top of mind right now.
Yeah, we've noticed a pattern where when you're developing a relationship with a certain project, the first time that you go out with something, so like our first podcast episodes were very nerve wracking. Like we didn't know how we'd be received, and we wanted to have some feedback. So we were intentionally going to ask people to give feedback, which probably mounted the pressure a little bit more on top of that. But now, like, this is our fifth episode, and I don't know, I'm feeling way less insecure and unsure about what we're doing in the podcast. We're still finding our way, and there's definitely uncertainty and doubt about how, like, the quality of it. And I don't, there's like a comfort though with just the act of doing it. So we've gotten over, I think, the release anxiety as such, and there's to an extent, like there, it's still there, but it's minimized. So there's something about the relationship you have with a project, and once it's formed
Yeah.
and you're in this habit of releasing, it becomes easier. And that only goes so far. If you're doing like a pivot or you're changing direction somehow, like with a project, then it's almost even more difficult. Like you've got this relationship and you're trying to change the shape of it. So it can pop up in lots of different ways. But yeah, there's something about this, like
Yeah.
knowing your project and being good with it and being in practice of releasing with it.
The thing that's popping up there is the idea of having an image of what the thing, the project or the release could be or is, and all of that's muddled before you get it out the door. And so it can be very difficult to understand the reality of how it exists in the world without putting it out into the world, and this
Yeah.
can freeze you up. And there are tendencies, especially if you have really high standards, and the
Yeah.
type of people that we tend to work with, and both of us have. I have this, I think, maybe a bit more than you do, but like the vision of what it can be
Yeah.
and where you are in the process can
Yeah.
get muddled in
Yeah.
this place. And this can be really, really like an intense thing to work with, because the the reality of bringing a bigger vision, especially a vision that has a lot of depth and you can feel it into being, is like it's a stepwise process that it will always take longer than you imagine. So
Yeah.
when you're moving into those first releases, you have this sense of what it can be, but where it is right now. And
Yeah.
that it just, so if you can, when you get it out the door, like what you're doing is relating to the reality of where you are.
Yeah.
And
Now. Yeah.
this is, I think, the settling that you're talking about. Like, okay, we're here and like we can play in this place.
Yeah.
The expectations are starting to be managed, and
Yeah.
we and then the trust in ourselves to find our way to what we're trying to become starts to settle in. Then we're
Yeah.
just doing reps because
Yeah.
it's always reps. Yeah.
Well, and this is the reason why we have vision and aspiration, because we are trying to grow into and trying to develop into, whether it's a product and like ourselves in relationship to it, or even doesn't even have to be a product. Like release anxiety applies everywhere, and
Yeah.
this vision aspiration applies everywhere. Uh, it could be as simple as you're writing an essay for the first
Mm.
time. I mean, in that sense, that's your product.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's there is like a striving to hit and become that thing, or to achieve that objective, that goal, that keeps you going. So part of the reason I'm kind of riffing on this is when you said settle, I had the felt sense of, it's not settling in the sense of
Mm.
I'm, yeah, settling with this is good enough and it doesn't need to be anything more. It's just getting good with where you're at in the process and along the journey. And this is where getting good with reality is just a general like tenet here, and something that comes up like is a core piece of meditation, just
Yeah.
noticing what's happening now and getting comfortable with that. And with meditation, that's whatever's in your awareness, and there is a sense of awareness that comes online, and finding comfort and settling into where you are on the journey. Because if it's like you're summiting a mountain. If you're constantly thinking about like the summit, but you're at base camp, like you're not being present, you're not going to prepare adequately. You need to be in a certain mindset while also holding to this goal that you're about to venture out into. So, yeah, that just popped in to my
No,
mind.
I think the balance of the goal and presence is it's a fundamental part of the process. Holding the goal loosely, like because you're not there yet, and if you start imagining yourself there, this is equivalent to setting impossible standards.
Yeah.
And so, if you are carrying that impossible standard every step of the way, then you are exerting so much extra energy and not being present to where the process of getting there, right? And
Yeah.
which is the whole point of a work like this.
Yeah.
And
And
it's really easy to fall into this. Like there are all kinds of things that pop up and sort of pull you out of presence because working with the intensity is difficult.
if you're setting impossible standards for yourself and you're carrying that with you, the likelihood that you're going to start beating up on yourself in some way
Totally.
and not showing compassion for what it's like to be going through this process, it's much higher.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think another note here is what we've found for ourselves and the founders that we like to work with. There, a lot of the reason that we have this release anxiety is because we really care about what we're building,
Yeah.
and like that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
So we want to be in service of something greater than ourselves. We're pouring it into this project, this product, whatever it might be. So it's just like a perfect storm for a lot of pitfalls, basically, because there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of expectations, there's a lot of attachment to this vision of when you do get to have the final form and look at all the good that it's doing in the world, look how it's affecting you, look at the person that you've become in the process. So we want to talk today about what some of those like common pitfalls are and obstacles and challenges that we've run into, and that we actually like helping people to wrestle with these challenges, because yeah, we talked about this a little bit earlier today. It's way easier to help other people go through the process, and not everyone likes to do this. Like we both have a calling to this, as like a coach or a guide, like that kind of role in the world. And the reason we like helping other people navigate this terrain is because one, we've done it ourselves, so we have the direct experience, and two, it's not as personal. So we have the ability to kind of step outside and be able to witness and participate within your journey, but it's not our journey as such. So we're able to be a little bit more steady as a guide, and it's crazy fulfilling. It feels really good to be
Yeah.
able to share your lessons learned with other people along the way.
Yeah. My stance on this, all of that for sure, is the number of times that I've pushed into big releases and supported other people in big releases, but in particular, the times that I've been in the murk and the muck
Yeah.
and could have used what
Yeah.
we're offering, just my
We could
life
use
would
it
have
right
changed.
now.
Totally, right? Like having somebody to drop in who is like 1 foot in the project, like who understands the importance and cares for the outcome, but is also able to move into an objective stance. Like it is straddling like in and out of the project. This gives this this allows for the creator, the person moving through the process to uh, take some of the sort of objective energy from the coach, from the guide, and this can sort of clear up the process. All of a sudden, the thing that you're looking at in front of you, like in the case of
Or
a website,
clear.
like there's this thing that happens that I've noticed in doing creative works where like a critic can show up, like sneaks in the back door and then just starts taking everything to pieces. Like every little like word
Yeah.
has meaning like well beyond the overall vision. And having somebody else be like, that feels good, especially if you trust, like this thing is getting very close to being able to go out the door.
Yeah.
And if you can trust, like you can put your trust in that guide, the thing starts to clear up and you're like, okay, cool, like I can wear this, and it sort of lubricates the thing out the door a bit. So
Yeah. I think I just have one more thing before we jump into the um, challenges that we wrestle with and that we've seen other people wrestle with, is that relationship that you're talking about. There's a relationship between what you're releasing
yeah,
and whoever you're intending to release it with. So, in this sense, having a coach or guide as like a stand in for that, whoever that might be, because that's the hardest piece of this is you can't model what other people are thinking. I mean, you can in some way, like this is design, having empathy and understanding for how it might be received. But at the end of the day, we're only ourselves. We can't actually, like, I don't know, project our consciousness into other people or into entire populations of people to see how they would receive something. If we could, that would be crazy. I mean, to some extent, some people can, but it's an approximation.
yeah,
And yeah, so having a coach, or in some cases, it could be a trusted group of like reviewers or friends. This is people do peer editing or peer support, group work in this sense. But having people as a stand-in for that eventual audience that you are going to be in a relationship with is just helping placehold that until it gets out, and it's so important. Otherwise, you're kind of alone in your creation, which is fine. It can be harder.
yeah. I mean, again, this all depends. Some of the time you get little bumps and it just pops out the door, and it's not a big deal. But doing bigger works in particular, companies like product launches, these kinds of things, they're a bigger lift. So it helps to have other people. It is necessary to have other people carry it with you. I mean,
Yep.
that's just the nature of a bigger work. It's collaborative.
Yep.
Um, yeah, I don't
So
know. I think sort of the place that I like to start is on what it feels like from a first person perspective when you're in one of these like big releases that's coming, or an important release. I think is what I mean by big. And I tend to get, and I've heard from other people, like fantasies, like because you don't know yet, and you're I don't know, your mind is trying to paint a picture in which this thing is coming into reality, and in the depths of doing the work, you get all kinds of things, and a lot of these are sort of like inflated and deflated, like sort of fantastical fantasies. So like one of the things is when I get this thing out, people are gonna love it so much. Like you feel the like possibility of the grandiosity of getting it done, which okay, a little of that feels good because like like I'm proud of this. I want to get it done, but a lot of that can be like really tough because that's where the standards start sneaking in again. And then another one is the sort of negative like stance, which is like if I release this thing, it's not good enough. People will actively hate it. They will hunt me down and kill me for doing something like this poor. And so I don't know. I think people have different experiences of this kind of thing, but I'll get the full gamut.
Yeah, I think related to those fantasies, part of the sort of overarching thing here is you want to get it right,
Yeah.
and you're projecting these things out towards that end. And the main thing is you don't, it gets in the way a little
Yeah.
bit, like
Yeah.
obviously the fantasy. So if you think that people are going to love it so much and then you're trying to perfect it,
Mm-hmm.
like that's not going to work. So like don't let perfect be the enemy of the good sort of comes up here.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, I don't know, like don't, like there's some inverse of that phrase that it's not coming to mind, but don't be enamored with the corpse that you're imagining right now.
I mean, effectively, yeah. Both of those, like, so those dramatic swings, right, are a way to avoid the intensity of where you are right now, right? And either perfection. I mean, I think they're both perfection problems, right? And this is ameliorated by uh, just it can be wrong. It and
Yes.
like like failing and like pushing something out the door to get into conversation with the world is always going to be better than whatever you can imagine by yourself.
Yeah.
And
It's
so,
not even really a failure at that point. It's just it's a way of getting more information. And if it like failure can be sort of reframed in that context. I mean, it's still if you wanted it to be one thing and then it's something else and how it's received, it's you could file that under failure. But there's a way to kind of shift that, and the perfectionist mind will want to play with that. But you're getting information, and that can be instructive and a guide for how to move forward.
totally.
Yeah, but we have a general sense that, wrong or not perfect and released is like almost better than polishing. Like polishing a turd is a phrase people use. You become enamored with it. Like you might get trapped in that fantasy that Dave's talking about, like that people are going to love this so much, but you've been isolated and maybe people don't really care. So,
Yeah.
you know, wrong and released is better than polished and unreleased too.
Yep.
Um, yeah, another thing that will come up, like a big pitfall, is this felt sense of the desire to just stop working on it.
Mm-hmm.
Or, and this will come up, like we talked about this a bit with FUD, because a lot of this is related to FUD. So you're having some experience of fear, uncertainty, doubt, discomfort. And we talked about this in the last episode. FUD likes to masquerade in plain view. So shiny object syndrome, other things coming up, priorities all of a sudden becoming out of whack. And yeah, all of a sudden you're like, I don't really need to be doing that thing. That's not important. I'm not gonna prioritize it, or I'm just gonna drop it. Like I don't need to do that. So that one is especially pernicious because if you drop it, you're not working on it,
Yeah,
which
this one pops up a lot with people. It's the 90% syndrome. Like you have done all of this work, and then the last 10% is the most intense on all of these things. Like we're right in the middle of this thing, and the amount of stuff popping up. And so the one of the responses to that intensity is just to like it's not worth it for all of the reasons, right? So I'm just going to set this one is not going to cut it. And what can happen is, and I've met a few people who have struggled with this. Everything in their life is at 90%, like because they're fine getting to a place where like it's good enough, but that last 10% where they have to face possible critique or they have to get information from the world is almost unbearable. And so like the felt sense of quitting is a relief there. But you know, they're subtly diverting themselves, or unsubtly in this case,
Totally.
from what they're trying to envision in the world.
Well, and that catches up to you if you have this like
Totally.
graveyard of half baked ideas and projects that
Yeah.
you intended to ship. Yeah, there's something in like, we're going to talk a bit about what the act of releasing, like why it's good as a habit, as a process. When you're not releasing, you're getting backed up and you're also not flexing the muscle of releasing, which means that it becomes harder and harder to release. But you have to release to be in conversation in the world, and you need to be in conversation in the world if you want your product to be out and alive, and we want our products to be out and alive.
Yep.
Yeah. So I think there's another little thing that pops up, moving towards release, which is similar than like the desire to stop working on it, is just the total isolation, or isolating to like a degree that's not healthy for you potentially. And then within that space, like it's like almost like you come up with your own logic of the world that's not real. So you're kind of lying to yourself. Like, no one knows what I'm going through right now. So I couldn't possibly share this with my friend who is not my audience and doesn't know what I'm talking about like in detail, but I couldn't possibly share to get some support. And a lot of this comes from just being in a high vulnerability state,
Yeah.
that you're pushing out, you're doing something unknown. But if you isolate like completely and start feeding yourself these stories, and then you're not talking to people as much, so people can't check you on that. And I've definitely had friends who are just like, wait, what are you talking about? Like the narrative that you might have, that you don't know what you're doing and you're not sure how things are going. They're either going to call you on that, or if you do have the courage to share with friends, what I've also found is they will reflect, oh, I'm seeing the journey that you've been on. This is an interesting twist in the road. Like, I've been following like what
Yeah.
you've been talking about over the past few months or years or whatever it is. And it almost, again, just being in relationship is one of the keys here. And it doesn't always have to be like with your audience and the end user, whoever that is. You can get support from other people along the way, and they're not necessarily guides per se, they're just supports. So
Yeah. It this one is a pernicious one, and I don't know if this is. I've experienced this, and I don't know if there's a more masculine tendency to fall into this one. You're in the workshop and you're building and you're building and you're building and you're building, and then all of a sudden, like you haven't socialized in 2 months, and like you've got this big thing that you don't know how to explain to people because you've layered on so much, and then you're like, the act of explaining this thing is
it's a
going to be
lot.
so hard, so I can't do it. Then you go another month. Like I've experienced this, and definitely have run into engineering and designing friends who have experienced this. Yeah, so the it's there can be a stage fright thing that happens there,
Yeah.
and like just the thought of getting on stage, like, and being blinded by lights and all this kind of thing can freeze you up. But yeah, there are ways out of these things.
Yeah. So I think, I don't know if you have any other kinds of challenges or
Mm.
pitfalls or wrestling matches that we have with releasing. I think we've got a
Yeah,
decent,
I think that's a good overview.
yeah. So with that backdrop and like kind of the tension, and it doesn't feel good. The reason why we focus on releasing, and we're going to talk a little bit now about what releasing affords you as a creator, as a founder, and some ways to structure it. So kind of flipping the valence a little bit and being more proactive and strategic about understanding why it's important, and also ways that you can do it. So
Yeah.
Yeah, releases are how we grow. And we've talked a lot about just the conversation. It's how you have a conversation with the world. And the reason why it's so scary is because you are getting that feedback and reflection. And it might not be something that you're ready for, but it's the most important thing that you can have to grow. Nothing grows in isolation. Things grow in relationship, in some kind of relational web. So that's why we release. And yeah, I don't know, Dave, if you want to talk about the act of releasing, how it can like literally clear your mind, and then what happens as a result of that.
Yeah, this one is resident in me right now. Uh, yeah, there is the movement towards release, and when you're building a project, especially after a longer cycle, say 6 weeks or something in our case, and if it goes beyond that, it rough. You're carrying around like all of the work that you've been doing, and it's running on background cycles in you.
Totally.
And so I'll notice, like yesterday I noticed I was on a walk or whatever, and this is one of the things that I do to try and like
Clear
work
your
with
head a
the
little.
intensity.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just feel saturated, like there's a lump in the middle of my head,
Yeah.
and that thing is basically a representation of what is about to be released.
Mm.
So when you move when you move it out the door, and now it's no longer yours, you let the bird out of the nest kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
What you have is this room, this clearing in yourself that affords you a couple of things. One, it affords you the ability to have it be over there, like it's everybody else's problem now.
You have a different perspective than immediately. That's I
Totally.
just got a visual of that. Yeah.
Right away. It's over there and it's in other people's minds, right? And so just that moving of distance, what happens is a flood of like, oh, that's what I was trying to do, and this is what's trying to happen here, comes in, and you can get a lot of really good work done right after release, because there's a clarity online, because that lump in the middle of your head is now in everybody else's head, and it's dispersed. And then you start to get feedback, which helps you see it through other people's eyes, and this kind of thing. The other aspect of clearing out, it it makes room for creative energy to make connections across
Serendipities. Yeah.
all of these kinds of things. So it's a very enlivening and creative, and can be very intense in a different way right after that. And so knowing that this is going to happen
It's like
and
a
you can
flood
harness
of
it.
new information. Yeah.
Totally. But each one of those is a kind of energetic engine. So you build it up, you push it out the door, you get some reflective space, you start to add in what is important about what the next round of this is going to be.
Yeah.
Again, you can get into a cadence and you start to build a flywheel this way.
Totally. And one thing that we hadn't talked about previously, but I got like this visualization when you're talking about the clearing and the felt sense of what happens after you release. I was like, oh, you get a dance floor then.
Yeah.
You want to create some room to celebrate, and
Mhm.
that feeling of levity of that you got it out, you don't have the lump in your head, whatever it is. And I mean, honestly, literally, I probably do dance and get silly and like weird. I've been noticing this over the last few days as we get closer, and also, of course, excited for vacation. But part of it is we're doing the thing. We have this website draft that we're almost finished with. We're going to be able to ship it, we're going to be able to move it into the next phase. And allowing and giving yourself space to celebrate that, I think, is really important when you have that clearing.
Yeah, for me, it shows up. I'm much less fun. Uh, what I want to do is show it off. Like, I'm proud of this thing. Like, I'm curious what other people think, and I want to make it. I want to make it better. But there is a gift in being able to wear whatever this thing is out into the world, and new possibilities are opening up. Like,
Yeah.
ways of seeing the world are now available that weren't previous to the release. So
Yeah.
it's fun.
Well, I think you need both. You need to celebrate, but you also need to keep working it. So, because if you just put it out and then you're not, if you didn't design ways for receiving feedback, or you're
Yeah.
not in conversation with people, how are you going to know how it was received if you're just busy celebrating and having a drink or going out dancing with friends, like whatever it is you need to do to celebrate?
Yeah.
giving yourself room to do that and starting that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we were going to end with two concrete practices that you can pick up right now and design with. The I don't know if you have a sense, Dave, of which one to focus on first.
Um, I
They're
think that
related.
yeah, they're both related. I think one's a macro process and one's a micro process. And so the micro process is something that I think is good to have as like part of your ecology of practices. It's effectively training the release, uh, it's release conditioning effectively. And you can do this with like smaller releases on a consistent basis. I love to do this through art projects. And social media is good for this, and all kinds of different things. Like you could do it with pottery, but um, basically the concept is creating a form and some studio time for you to express something and move that expression into a public sphere, right? And that can be sharing with your friends, or if you're trying to work with the intensity, moving it further out into a stage that maybe uh, freaks you out a little bit, right? And as you condition this movement and working with the small projects, you
Yep.
can work with the intensities in a sort of contained way. And I think this is one of the best like long term practices to have. And you can change what you're working on and what media you're working in and all of this kind of thing. But it has paid me back like over the whole of my sort of creative career.
You're really talented at doing this too, of setting up new creative practices. I've found like micro release practices. I mean I admire it and would would like to be better at it because you're doing it on a personal basis just for warming up different skills that you want to explore and different expressions that you're like tapping into. And I just have such a hard time carving out the space. And because I'm out of practice of it, it's a fractal of what we've been talking about. I don't have the practice of it and
Yeah.
I don't have the experience of what it's like to release with it. I was just talking to a friend yesterday and she started doing this for some of her work, but it's social media work that she hasn't done before, and it's clearing out so many of her
Yeah.
preconceived notions that maybe I just don't have what it takes to be a designer. Maybe I'm just
Mm.
not really committed to this. I don't have the drive or the pizzazz or whatever like the story
Fantasy.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then she started doing these just Instagram videos, like walking through, and she found after just a few of them, she wants to do more. She's like excited. She has this new kind of inspiration and excitement about her work more generally. So, yeah, I'm like, oh, I
That's
need a
part of
little bit of this.
that's part of that engine, right?
Yeah,
Like the excitement shows up, and you start seeing it as a possibility rather than a chore.
yeah,
And but starting these things is always hard.
yeah,
What's popping to mind right now, and we'll move on to the other practice, is just having a community where you can play
yeah,
with these
yeah,
things. It's so
yeah,
it makes this so much easier.
yeah.
So like at some point, if we can get the energy together to have like a micro practice release community kind of thing, like it would be
I
interesting.
would say when, not if.
Yes, when
Foreshadowing.
foreshadowing. So yeah, the other practice is sort of the more macro practice, and we can just move through this one. It's basically like in the grand scheme of a big project, you have to chunk like what you're working on,
Yeah,
and so building your release cycles to
yep,
be uh, shorter. Like you can do 2 week cycles that gives you like a really faster cadence, and there are certain times when that helps a lot, but not really going over 6 weeks,
yeah,
and especially not trying to plan past that
yeah,
because it's all fantasy, it's all imagination, and that can be fine for like sort of doing vision work and like a huge vision, but like the actual production work being in like a 6 week or a 4 week chunk, um, it gives you like a sort of recursive feedback loop. You're getting into reality more often. You're working with the conditioned startle responses around the anxieties and all this kind of thing. Yeah,
yeah. And I think like what you're alluding to is you can set the form of the process, the cycles for releasing without creating like the content that you're going to produce in each release.
Yeah.
Like what we were talking about earlier, when you do release and you have all of this new information that you didn't have before, that's why you don't get too far ahead of yourself in scheduling out the content, because you're about to get a lot more information and content to put into your sort of creative mix.
Yes.
And that you want to inform the next cycle instead of what you thought, 3 cycles ago that you were going to get into.
It's always different than what you like. The further you plan out into the future,
The
the
less known
wronger
it
you
is.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The wronger you are.
Yeah. And so like just keeping track of the duration of your release cycles, because the longer those get,
Yep.
the more the anxieties will show up, and the isolations and the fantasies and all these kinds of things can become more difficult to work with. So
Yep.
yeah.
So yeah, that's what we've got for today. We'd love to hear from you if you have experienced any release anxiety recently and how that's kind of manifested. Maybe how you've released or celebrated after a release. Yeah, I don't know. Tell us what you're working on and what it's been like to share it with the world.
Sounds good.
Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye.